The winter air hung heavy with a silence that felt almost rehearsed, an unsettling quiet that followed the captured German women as they were marched across the barren stretch of land. Snow crushed beneath their worn boots, each step carrying the weight of uncertainty, fear, and the lingering echo of a war that had already taken too much from them. The world around them seemed emptied of color, reduced to shades of gray and white, as if nature itself had stepped back from the harshness of human conflict. These women had not been soldiers. Some were nurses. Some were farm workers. Some were simply caught on the wrong side of a shifting front line. Yet now they were all prisoners, grouped together under the cold gaze of Soviet guards, driven forward without explanation. Their destination remained hidden, like a secret no one was willing to speak aloud. The cold was an enemy of its own. It clung to their clothes, bit into their fingers and numbed their faces. Yet the silence among them was even colder. What could they say? What words existed for this strange captivity? They were being taken somewhere, but the purpose of this march remained a haunting mystery. And mysteries in times of war rarely led to mercy. In the distance, the outline of a camp began to take shape, rows of wooden barracks framed by barbed wire and guarded watchtowers. The closer they came, the more the dread thickened. Every step made the camp feel less like a place of temporary detainment and more like a world governed by unfamiliar rules. The women exchanged glances, each one silently asking the same question: what happens now? Upon entering the camp, they were met with rigid procedures. Identifications were taken. Personal belongings were confiscated. The routines of war prisoners began to shape their days: long inspections, rationed meals, and endless hours of uncertain waiting. It was a strange existence, suspended between past and future, hope and despair. But amid all the routine came a moment that pierced through the monotony, an order so bizarre, so unexpected, that the women could not help but freeze in confusion. It happened without warning, delivered in a blunt tone that suggested practicality rather than cruelty. An officer stepped forward, looked at them with clinical detachment, and issued a command so odd it bordered on surreal. In a place governed by harsh discipline, hunger, and cold, the demand felt almost absurd in comparison. It was not a command to kneel. Not an order to surrender more belongings. Not a threat, not a punishment, not even a lecture. It was something no one could have predicted. A demand that would leave every woman staring back in disbelief, unsure if they had heard correctly. A demand that would echo through the camp, whispered among the prisoners with growing curiosity and discomfort. A demand that would mark the beginning of one of the strangest and most unsettling episodes of their captivity. Before that moment, the camp had felt grim but predictable. But now something had shifted. Something strange was about to unfold. Something that would later be retold with equal parts shock, confusion, and dark humor. This was the quiet before the bizarre. The last calm breath before the order that would leave an entire group of prisoners stunned, embarrassed, and completely unprepared. They didn't know it yet. But the strangest command of their lives was only seconds away. And the words that would echo across the camp were unlike anything they had heard before. The morning began like all others, cold, muted, and painfully slow. A weak sun hovered behind a blanket of clouds, offering light but refusing warmth. The German women lined up in the courtyard, exhausted and resigned, each one already familiar with the endless rhythm of camp life. Roll call. Inspection. Waiting. Always waiting. But this morning felt different, though no one could explain why. The guards moved with a strange urgency, exchanging glances that suggested some new directive had arrived overnight. The women sensed it immediately. In captivity, intuition becomes a survival skill, honed sharp by fear and uncertainty. A whistle cut through the air, sharp enough to make a flock of crows burst from a nearby tree. The prisoners stiffened. An officer stepped forward, stern-faced, expression unreadable, posture carved from stone. He carried a clipboard tucked under his arm, as if preparing to deliver a bureaucratic procedure rather than anything alarming. Yet the tension rose with every step he took. The women braced themselves for another roll call, another confiscation, another lecture about camp rules. But then he stopped, planted his boots firmly on the frozen ground, and looked across the assembled group as though evaluating them for the first time. The silence became fragile, so delicate that even the slightest sound could shatter it. And then, with a calmness that made the moment even more surreal, the officer gave the order. A command so out of place, so baffling, that for several seconds the women simply stared back in disbelief, their minds scrambling to make sense of what they had just heard. It took a moment for the absurdity to settle in, and when it did, confusion spread across every face like a ripple across still water. Some women blinked rapidly, convinced they had misunderstood. Others glanced sideways at their companions, hoping for clarification. A few subtly leaned forward, waiting, almost begging, for someone to repeat the instruction, perhaps with a more logical explanation attached. But no clarification came. Instead, the officer repeated the order, this time louder, firmer, and with the unmistakable tone of someone who expected immediate compliance. The demand hung in the freezing air, heavy and embarrassing, as though the very atmosphere recoiled from it. Even the guards seemed uncomfortable, shifting slightly, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to notice the women's stunned reactions. The captives were used to harsh treatment, used to humiliation, used to the brutal mechanics of war, but they had not been prepared for this. This command felt different. Not violent. Not strategic. Not related to discipline or control. It felt intrusive, almost personal, in a way that war rarely bothered to be. The women hesitated, unsure how to respond, unsure if refusal would bring punishment, or if compliance would bring an even deeper embarrassment. In the cold, their breaths formed clouds that mingled together, tiny plumes of fear drifting upward and dissolving into the gray sky. No one moved first. No one wanted to. But in a prison camp, hesitation is dangerous. Eventually, one woman, elderly, exhausted, trembling more from dread than cold, stepped forward. She did not speak. She simply obeyed. And that single act broke the invisible barrier between resistance and submission. Slowly, reluctantly, the others followed, each movement filled with discomfort and disbelief. The courtyard became a strange theater, every prisoner acting out a scene they had never rehearsed and never wanted to perform. The guards watched in awkward silence, the officer remained stoic, and the women endured the moment with a mixture of humiliation and bewilderment. None of them understood why this was happening. None of them could guess what purpose it served. None of them would forget how it made them feel. Little did they know that this bizarre command was only the beginning. The real explanation, stranger, darker, and unexpectedly practical, was still hidden behind walls of military policy, superstition, and the twisted logic of war. The mystery had only just begun. A brittle wind swept across the camp as the women stood frozen in place, their uncertainty growing heavier by the second. What had begun as a routine morning had now twisted into something surreal, an inspection unlike anything they had ever imagined. The officer's strange order still echoed in their minds, its absurdity clashing with the grim seriousness of their surroundings. As the women complied, reluctantly and cautiously, the guards formed a rough perimeter around the courtyard. They were not laughing. They were not smirking. They were not exchanging crude glances or private comments. Instead, their posture was stiff, almost uncomfortable, as though even they found the entire procedure embarrassing. This was not mockery. Not entertainment. Not a punishment designed to degrade. It was something else. Something oddly procedural. Something that felt rehearsed, as though these guards had been instructed to perform this strange inspection with precise care. The women, however, were left in the dark. Every prisoner lowered her gaze, focusing on the cold ground beneath her as the guards walked through the rows, observing carefully but silently. The atmosphere carried an odd tension, one that came not from brutality but from confusion. The women did not know what the guards were searching for. They only felt the sting of being placed in such a vulnerable position. The officer continued to observe with clinical detachment, his eyes scanning the group as though conducting a study rather than an inspection. His expression remained unchanged, stern, controlled, unreadable. Whatever they were doing, he believed it mattered. Minutes felt like hours. Each second passed slowly as if stretched by discomfort. The cold bit at their exposed skin, but no one dared move. Not a whisper. Not a protest. Just the quiet endurance that had become second nature in captivity. Eventually the guards began taking notes. Small gestures. Quick glances toward the officer. Brief, murmured confirmations. The women noticed that certain prisoners were marked on the clipboard while others were ignored. No explanation followed. No reaction was offered. Just silent observation and methodical recording. The women exchanged uneasy glances. Why were some being noted? What did the guards see that they themselves could not? What possible purpose could this unusual inspection serve? The officer stepped forward again. He paced slowly before the group as if contemplating what came next. His boots thudded softly against the frozen earth, each step echoing through the courtyard like a ticking clock counting down to an unknown conclusion. The tension grew unbearable. Then, without warning, he issued a new command. This one was more familiar, simple, direct, military in tone. The women quickly complied, relieved to move, relieved to return even momentarily to the cold predictability of camp life. But the bizarre inspection lingered in their minds. As the formation dissolved, the women whispered among themselves in cautious tones, careful not to draw attention. Some believed the procedure had been a humiliation tactic. Others were convinced it was a health inspection of some peculiar kind. A few, thinking more practically, suspected it had something to do with disease prevention, perhaps frostbite, infections, or lice. But no explanation seemed completely satisfying. The guards did not clarify anything. They simply returned to their posts as silent as before. The officer retreated to the command hut, clutching his clipboard as though it contained data too important to share. The day's routine resumed, but the women's thoughts remained trapped in that strange moment. The inspection was over, yet its purpose remained a ghost hovering over the camp, unseen, unanswered, unsettling. What had they been looking for? What did the markings on the clipboard mean? Why this kind of inspection? The only thing the prisoners knew for sure was this. Something was happening behind the scenes. Something that stretched beyond humiliation or routine. Something connected to a fear the Soviet guards never openly acknowledged. And the truth behind the bizarre demand was stranger than any of them could yet imagine. The strangeness of the morning lingered long after the inspection had ended. The women returned to their barracks with heavy minds, carrying more questions than they had started the day with. The wooden floors creaked beneath their steps as they settled into the dim shelter, exchanging wary glances. A stove crackled faintly in the corner, but its warmth did little to cut through the unease. For hours the camp felt different, quieter, more watchful. Even the guards seemed more tense, glancing toward the command hut as though expecting new instructions. Something was unfolding, but no one knew what it was. The women tried to distract themselves with the small routines of survival, mending clothing, sharing scraps of bread, checking on the elderly among them, yet the mystery gnawed at them. Why had the guards carried out such an unusual check? Why now? Why in such a meticulous manner? In captivity, imagination can become both a refuge and a torment. Some believed it was merely another attempt at control. Others suspected superstition, the kind soldiers cling to when logic collapses under the weight of war. A few whispered about rumors they had heard months earlier, stories of camps where peculiar inspections had taken place for reasons never explained. But the truth, as it quietly revealed itself, was neither rumor nor superstition. It began with a single piece of information, overheard accidentally. Late in the afternoon, as one prisoner carried a bucket of water from the well, she passed two Soviet guards speaking in low voices near the fence. The conversation was rushed, urgent, their words clipped with worry. She didn't catch everything, but she heard enough to stop her breath. A disease. Not famine. Not punishment. Not humiliation. A disease. One that the guards feared desperately. By evening, the whispers spread through the barracks. The strange inspection had not been about control, it had been about detection. The guards had been checking the prisoners for early signs of a highly contagious condition that had circulated among Soviet troops and local civilian populations during the bitter months of winter. It was not glamorous. It was not strategic. It was not political. It was practical, brutally, urgently practical. The disease, the prisoners learned piece by piece, often showed its first symptoms in the extremities. The cold made it worse. If left unnoticed, it could spread rapidly in cramped quarters like the barracks, endangering both captives and guards alike. Suddenly, the morning's surreal command began to take shape. The clipboard, the whispering guards, the uncomfortable silence, the fear behind the officers' eyes. This was not about humiliation at all. It was about containment. Life in a prison camp was already a delicate balance of hardship and routine. A disease outbreak would break that balance instantly, turning fear into panic and order into chaos. The guards were not protecting the prisoners, they were protecting the camp itself, including themselves. As the truth settled in, the women felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was relief, that the bizarre inspection had not stemmed from cruelty. There was frustration, that they had been left uninformed, forced to endure embarrassment without explanation. And there was fear, real fear, at the thought that sickness could be lurking among them. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. Some women lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the wooden walls. Others thought of home, of safety, of what it meant to be powerless in a place where even one's health could become a matter of military concern. But above all, one thought overshadowed the rest. If the guards were afraid of an outbreak, then what came next? What measures would they take? What rules would change? What new procedures would the prisoners be forced to endure? The strange demand had finally been explained. But the consequences of that explanation were only beginning to show themselves. Night settled heavily over the camp, carrying with it a tension far thicker than the cold. The barracks, usually filled with quiet murmurs and soft movements, now felt suffocated by silence. The women lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling boards or into the flickering shadows cast by the stove's dying embers. Sleep did not come easily. Not when the mystery had finally revealed its purpose, and that purpose carried the word no prisoner ever wanted to hear: outbreak. Fear, once given the smallest crack to enter, spreads faster than any illness. By dawn, the atmosphere inside the camp had changed. The guards moved with a new restlessness, clutching wool collars tightly around their necks, avoiding lingering contact with the prisoners. Their glances were quick and wary, the kind reserved for things that might be dangerous even when motionless. The officer who had overseen the inspection now appeared more rigid than ever, as if the burden of responsibility had doubled overnight. The women too felt the shift. Every cough, every shiver, every pale face drew attention. Not suspicion, just raw shared fear. They checked one another quietly, trying to reassure themselves that the symptoms they saw were simply exhaustion or cold or hunger. But the mind plays tricks in captivity, turning harmless aches into warnings and ordinary fatigue into imagined evidence of something worse. Routine no longer felt like routine. Everything was being watched. The morning roll call was slower, more meticulous. Guards lingered longer in front of each prisoner, studying expressions, posture, even breath. The clipboard reappeared, but this time its presence brought dread instead of confusion. The camp doctor, a stern older man with tired eyes, was summoned to assist. His coat flapped in the wind as he crossed the yard, carrying a leather bag worn from years of overuse. He inspected the marked women one by one, his face unreadable, offering no explanation and no comfort. His silence was not cruelty, it was caution. Disease had a way of stripping away all other priorities. As the day progressed, subtle changes appeared. Barracks were reordered. Small groups were separated. Fires were stoked more frequently. Water rations were checked and rechecked. Even the guards' patrol paths shifted to limit contact. It wasn't chaos, but it wasn't normal. The women sensed they were living in a fragile in-between space, a suspended moment where the camp held its breath and waited to see what would happen next. Some tried to stay calm, tending to one another with quiet acts of kindness. Others retreated inward, wrestling with fear and silence. What troubled them most was not the inspection, nor the disease itself. It was the unknown. What would the guards do if symptoms appeared? Would the sick be quarantined? Moved? Taken away? In war, taken away rarely led anywhere comforting. Late in the afternoon, a faint commotion stirred near the command hut. A messenger had arrived, young, breathless, carrying documents sealed with urgency. The guards gathered, speaking in clipped, tense phrases. Whatever news had arrived, it was not encouraging. Their faces tightened, and the officer's jaw clenched as he read through the papers. Soon after, new orders echoed across the camp. The women were instructed to remain inside their barracks. Fires were to be kept burning. Ventilation was to be controlled. No one was to wander. Even the routine tasks, the well, the kitchen shed, the supply depot, were abruptly halted. It was not confinement. It was containment. The day darkened earlier than usual. Snow began to fall once more, soft flakes drifting like silent warnings from the sky. The women huddled together in their bunks, drawing what warmth they could from shared blankets and shared fear. They whispered theories, reassurances, prayers, anything to keep their thoughts from spiraling. Outside, the guards' footsteps continued in a steady rhythm, circling the barracks like watchful sentries around a fragile fire. This was no longer just a prison camp. It had become a quarantine zone. And as the night deepened, one truth settled over all of them. The bizarre order had been just the beginning. The real test of endurance, the one that would challenge their strength, their unity, and their hope, was now unfolding. The night that followed stretched endlessly, a long ribbon of darkness wrapped around the camp. Inside the barracks, the women clung to small pockets of warmth, listening to the cracking wood, the restless wind, and the steady footsteps of guards circling outside. No one slept deeply. Fear has a way of keeping even the tiredest eyes open. But by morning something had changed. The camp no longer buzzed with urgency. The guards' movements were slower, more deliberate, no longer driven by the frantic uncertainty of the previous day. The officer stood near the courtyard, speaking quietly with the camp doctor. Their tones were calm again, still serious but lacking the sharp edge of panic. The women sensed the shift long before any announcement was made. It was slowly, cautiously, they stepped out into the pale morning light when the disease, the prisoners the air was crisp but no longer carried the same weight of dread. In the extremities. The officer waited, the cold clipboard tucked under his arm, if left unnoticed, behind his back. Spread rapidly in cramped quarters nearby, barracks, his expression more relaxed than it had been in days. When the officer addressed them, his voice began to take shape. Not warm, not friendly, just steady. The whispering guards. Steady was enough. The uncomfortable silence. The strange inspection, the sudden fear behind the officer's intense surveillance. This was not about humiliation by a single suspected. It was about case noted in a nearby military prison camp was already a delicate balance of hardship. The threat had been genuine. A disease outbreak the guards feared had not reached the camp, turning fear into panic and order had not appeared among the prisoners. The guards were not protecting the prisoners, they were protecting the camp itself, washed over the women, but it came slowly, as the truth settled in, the women like someone dipping their hand into cold water to test if it was relief that they lowered their shoulders had not stemmed from cruelty. Some exchanged weary smiles that they had been left flashes of humanity in a place that offers so without explanation. For the first time since the bizarre order had shattered their routine, that sickness could be lurking among normal again. That night, the restrictions were quieter than usual. Barracks reopened. Some women lay awake listening to the wind scrape against the wooden walls. Lighter, as others thought of home by a fear they had been trying to hide under the discipline of military duty, where even one's health could become a matter of military concern. But in the days that followed, the event turned into an odd mixture. If the guards were afraid of an outbreak among the women, then what came next? Something to whisper about. What measures would they take? Something to shake their heads at. What rules would change? Something that proved how unpredictable prisoners would be forced to endure. What had once been humiliating now became a strange, almost surreal memory. But the consequences of that explanation were only beginning to show themselves. The war with a touch of dark irony. Night settled heavily over the camp, in a world filled with loss, hunger, displacement, and danger. The mind clings to strange moments, quiet murmurs, even the absurd ones, as reminders of human vulnerability by silence. As the women lay on their bunks, the camp settled once more into its familiar shadows cast by the stove's dying embers. Yet something subtle had shifted within them. Not when the mystery had finally revealed its purpose, the fear of the unknown, and that purpose carried forced them to rely on one another in new ways. Outbreak, to share warmth, fear, once given the smallest crack to enter, face humiliation and fear side by side. By dawn, the atmosphere inside the camp became a lifeline. The guards even in a place carved by war, where freedom was a dream and survival around their daily struggle, avoiding lingering contact with the prisoners. Endurance, their glances were quick and wary. It grows quietly between things that might be dangerous even when most shared blankets. The officer who had overseen the inspection resilience that more rigid than ever, coldest places, as if the burden of responsibility had doubled overnight. The barbed wire still surrounded them. Every car outside still raged on. Every pale face drew attention. But for now the panic had passed. Not suspicion, the threat had faded. Shared fear. The camp exhaled. They checked one another and quietly, the bizarre command trying to reassure themselves that the symptoms they saw were simply exhaustion or cold or painful story of their captivity. But the mind plays tricks in captivity, where fear, turning harmless and humanity collided in one of the unlikely into imagined evidence of something worse. Routine no longer felt like routine. Everything was being watched. The morning roll call was slower, more meticulous. Guards lingered longer in front of each prisoner, studying expressions, posture, even breath. The clipboard reappeared, but this time its presence brought dread instead of confusion. The camp doctor, a stern older man with tired eyes, was summoned to assist. His coat flapped in the wind as he crossed the yard, carrying a leather bag worn from years of overuse. He inspected the marked women one by one, his face unreadable, offering no explanation and no comfort. His silence was not cruelty. It was caution. Disease had a way of stripping away all other priorities. As the day progressed, subtle changes appeared. Barracks were reordered. Small groups were separated. Fires were stoked more frequently. Water rations were checked and rechecked. Even the guards' patrol paths shifted to limit contact. It wasn't chaos, but it wasn't normal. The women sensed they were living in a fragile in-between space, a suspended moment where the camp held its breath and waited to see what would happen next. Some tried to stay calm, tending to one another with quiet acts of kindness. Others retreated inward, wrestling with fear and silence. What troubled them most was not the inspection, nor the disease itself. It was the unknown. What would the guards do if symptoms appeared? Would the sick be quarantined? Moved? Taken away? In war, taken away rarely led anywhere comforting. Late in the afternoon, a faint commotion stirred near the command hut. A messenger had arrived. Young, breathless, carrying documents sealed with urgency. The guards gathered, speaking in clipped, tense phrases. Whatever news had arrived, it was not encouraging. Their faces tightened, and the officer's jaw clenched as he read through the papers. Soon after, new orders echoed across the camp. The women were instructed to remain inside their barracks. Fires were to be kept burning. Ventilation was to be controlled. No one was to wander. Even the routine tasks, the well, the kitchen shed, the supply depot, were abruptly halted. It was not confinement. It was containment. The day darkened earlier than usual. Snow began to fall once more, soft flakes drifting like silent warnings from the sky. The women huddled together in their bunks, drawing what warmth they could from shared blankets and shared fear. They whispered theories, reassurances, prayers, anything to keep their thoughts from spiraling. Outside, the guards' footsteps continued in a steady rhythm, circling the barracks like watchful sentries around a fragile fire. This was no longer just a prison camp. It had become a quarantine zone. And as the night deepened, one truth settled over all of them. The bizarre order had been just the beginning. The real test of endurance, the one that would challenge their strength, their unity, and their hope, was now unfolding. The night that followed stretched endlessly, a long ribbon of darkness wrapped around the camp. Inside the barracks, the women clung to small pockets of warmth, listening to the cracking wood, the restless wind, and the steady footsteps of guards circling outside. No one slept deeply. Fear has a way of keeping even the tiredest eyes open. But by morning something had changed. The camp no longer buzzed with urgency. The guards' movements were slower, more deliberate, no longer driven by the frantic uncertainty of the previous day. The officer stood near the courtyard, speaking quietly with the camp doctor. Their tones were calm again, still serious but lacking the sharp edge of panic. The women sensed the shift long before any announcement was made.